Well, thank you everybody for joining us today to talk about the Furniture Industry Sustainability Programme. Great start for a Monday morning. First, let me introduce myself and my colleagues here. My name's Joanna Knight. I am a marketeer, but more recently trained in sustainability, working primarily in the furniture sector and interiors. I also have here John Hubbard, who is technical consultant at FIRA and also an auditor for FISP. And we have Ian Allcock, who is the supply chain sustainability manager for ScS. And we are all on the advisory council at FISP. So hopefully we can give you a bit more insight. But perhaps if I start by throwing over to John, if I could ask you to give an overview of FISP and what's it's about.
Hello, so I'm John Hubbard. I've worked in the industry for, the consumer products industry for about 6 years. A lot of that has been in chemicals and sustainability. And recently I joined FIRA about 2 years ago and took over the FISP brief as part of FIRA. FISP is not owned by FIRA. This is an important point. It is actually owned by the industry and the members of FISP. So it is an industry scheme for the industry, by the industry, which I think is one of its important selling points. If you look at the other communications tools of sustainability, things like ISO 14000. ISO 14000 is a great scheme, but because it is very broad in its application, it can apply to almost any industry. Then what FISP does is it takes the principles of that and applies it to the real concerns of the furniture industry. And the three pillars that we really sort of want with FISP is credibility, that having FISP is a genuine sustainability statement where you don't want to be part of the greenwash. Applicability, that it's the industry is accessible to both the larger players in the industry, but also some smaller players in the industry who have a really strong sustainability story. And the third one, it needs to be pushing the industry forward. It needs to be leading the industry in the sustainability communication and activity. It's not just about standing still and having a tick in a box. It's about where you're going. And a lot of what FISP is about continual improvement and going forward.
I think that's an important point, and also an important point that it's not just for, we're here today at the January Furniture Show that's primarily for the domestic and retail furniture sector, but it's for all sectors of the industry. I spend most of my life in the office and contract furniture market, and I find it really interesting how the two sides of the industry can actually learn from each other and grow with each other, and that's a real benefit of FISP. But Ian, can I turn to you?
Yes, of course.
And I think what would be interesting to understand is, obviously you're a big name on the high street, not you personally,
No,
ScS. And what are your aspirations in terms of sustainability, and how does FISP fit into that?
I suppose from our perspective as a retailer, we work with suppliers of various different sizes, from a multi-billion-pound organisation to very small manufacturers. And what we need to make sure is that in our sustainability journey, we've got a level of a scalable solution for the suppliers. So we're not asking for a massive 14,001 management system or anything along those lines. What we want to do is use the FISP to develop a sustainability journey for each and every supplier that works at the speed and the level of resources that they've got. So for us, it's of critical importance to get all of our suppliers on board with the sustainability program so that we can help achieve our environmental targets.
I think that's a really interesting point, because obviously I'm quite sure you've probably got some really large companies within your supply chain as well as some SMEs, and there are some quite interesting companies emerging, and so may still be at very much the sort of micro business stage, but often will have very innovative ideas relating to environmental performance. Do you think that's one of the things that makes FISP work is the fact that it doesn't have to be just for the big multinationals.
Absolutely. I mean, we could have set our minimum threshold, say, an international standard and so on. But in doing so, we would avoid, dealing with smaller suppliers, and actually we want a range and a mixture of suppliers on board that, say, then they'll all be at different levels. And they said the accessibility element of it is particularly important for us.
John, do you find that sometimes, that smaller companies think, oh, well, environmental responsibility, that's not for me, or feel that it's so expensive or so prohibitive, or indeed are embarrassed because they're only at that maybe very early stage?
Yeah, and that is one of the things that FISP is designed to do. Because it is a modular scheme, there are some mandatory modules, and for manufacturers, like timber is an important mandatory module. But we have two different schemes, one for sort of manufacturers and one for retailers, fit-out companies and distributors. So again, what is mandatory for one is not mandatory for the other. So again, an adaptability. But a lot of people are sort of very nervous. But the thing is, they can select the modules, because some organisations are very strong on things like use of timber, their procurement process. Others are very, very positive about what they're doing at end of life and reusability. And what FISP does is it allows them to display their strengths. And because it's not a graded thing, it is digital. You have the report will have all the scoring in, which is for the development of the individual companies, so that what they can do going forward. But they have the FISP certification, and it gives them the opportunity to sort of say, where do we want to go? But we have this, we are on the journey, and we're on the journey. I know some of the perhaps larger organisations would perhaps prefer a scored system, but that would very much weight it and might actually allow cause some of the smaller companies to sort of take a step back and say, that's not for us, because we wouldn't score as highly because we've not got the resource to do all the things that you need to do.
I think that's a very valid point, and also the point is that everybody's at different stages on their journey. And we were laughing whilst we were having coffee and talking about the fact that ScS and DFS were sat around the same table having coffee. And I guess that's what I love about sustainability, is that we can all learn from each other. And it's more about partnering and recognizing, obviously, where you compete, and therefore those subjects are ring-fenced. But so much to do with environmental responsibility and social values does not need to be ring-fenced. It can very much be a collaboration, and we can all learn from each other and move forward, because ultimately, without sounding too trite, we're talking about saving the planet. And, that shouldn't be for purely commercial gain. So, Ian, where do you see FISP sitting in your overall sustainability strategy?
Certainly for outside of social and quality management systems, it is the cornerstone of what we do. And it's specified within our supplier handbook that we want our suppliers working towards FISP membership and so on, and criteria. And it's really sort of embedded in what we do as a business, because I say we want to make sure that the smaller business can compete with the larger business, and we can do so on a platform and at a speed which works for all parties.
Brilliant. John, I guess I'm perhaps being a daydreamer here, but let's ask the question anyway. In the same way as FISP is now increasingly, as we've heard from Ian, specified by business-to-business buyers, do you think longer term it could be a badge of office and something recognised by the general public?
It would be nice to have something that did that job. I mean, in the past, we've had things like the European Eco Label that have tried to do that. That hasn't worked because it was, again, very limited to who could apply for that. It was not a scheme that is going to allow everyone to participate. And likewise, the proposed replacement for the eco-labelling scheme, the product environmental footprint, that would give a more nuanced information into the consumer about what products have. But again, it's a very expensive process, and it's not yet been demonstrated. But what FISP has done is that I think having a company like ScS coming on board, it has previously very much been in the contract sector. They have driven it forward because it's been that business to business. It going into the retail sector does allow perhaps the opportunity to begin to think about how this mark and this branding can be pushed out to the consumer and getting them to understand what it means without compromising it.
So we've talked a lot so far about environmental responsibility, but FISP, never mind FISP, sustainability in general, is really about the three pillars in terms of economics, everything has to be viable, the environment, and people. It's really about pulling people and planet together at the forefront. Is it encompassed within FISP?
Yeah, I mean, the way that FISP works is that there are three sections. One is a mandatory section about having a legal register and having an environmental policy. That's the first thing we do. You've got to do that. Then there are the environmental modules, which cover energy, waste, environmental management systems, transport, timber, those organisations that need it, air and water emissions. So if you're doing powder coating and things like that, that becomes important. And then design, eco-design and end of life. Then there's a separate module for economic and social activity, which includes relationships with the community, staff well-being, commitment to employment, local employment, including local contracting, and servicing, and but also then you're looking at things like communication within the industry and communication outside to other organisations and investment, so business resilience. All of those modules. Again, you don't have to complete all modules, but you have to have so many from the first section, which I think is 6 from the environmental section, and at least 4 from the social economic section. So it does, a business that has got FISP accreditation is taking account of all those things.
And really, we're hoping that people will also use it as a checklist, if you like, and that can use it as a way to look at their continuous improvement. Some of the big corporates can afford to do all these wonderful schemes and so forth, but some of the smaller companies perhaps have to take off bite-sized pieces. And I think that's the point, isn't it, is that they get the assessment and shouldn't see that as a criticism, but as an opportunity to move forwards.
Very much so. What we want FISP to be is actually a celebration of their positive environmental stories. It's a way to tell their sustainability and environmental strengths. What every FISP report will include, whether it's for a small group of 6 people working in a workshop somewhere or a big multinational, it will always have things that you can be, we would suggest as potential next steps where they can improve, because nobody is going to score 100%.
We touched on this very briefly. You talked about sort of waste management and maximising furniture's life cycle. It's a subject matter that I'm absolutely passionate about, partly because I spend a lot more time in the office and contract side, where typically when a lease expires, people will just hurl everything into a skip and start again. And that would all end up in landfill, or even these days, incineration. I mean, you see these phrases, zero to landfill, and reality is it's actually all going to incineration. So perhaps I should get off my soapbox now and ask you the question, are those issues in terms of how waste is managed, but also how products are designed in order to maximize their life cycle, are they part of the overall assessment program within FISP?
Yes, obviously waste management covers both waste during production and waste at the end of life, but identifying end of life and opportunities at end of life is an important section in FISP, and that's something that we are at the moment trying to revise the criteria to keep them as relevant as they has been and to push the industry forward. And one of the things is eco-design and end of life is we are very much looking at how we can best reflect that. Because again, these challenges that organisations face will very much be part of their distribution model. Because if they are selling single items to a whole range of different organisations, they're not going to be positioned to sort of know where all these products are and what happens to them at the end of life and bring them back. But if they're got a different relationship, and this is where the retailers might have a potential input in collecting furniture that has reached its end of its first life, then we can perhaps talk about where it goes after that, rather than it going to local landfill sites and potential less desirable routes for disposal.
Yeah. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, we were laughing. I don't know if anybody heard the music before we came on stage, but it was very much sort of 80s music, which, dare I say, is my era. And back in those days, and probably earlier than that, certainly when I was a kid, it was very much still a culture of make, do, amend. And I often blame my generation for much of the harm that's happened now, because we suddenly hit the 80s and it was happy days. You could buy lots and lots of stuff, and we did. And that sort of caused some of the situation that we're in now. Do you think, Ian, that people are beginning to recognise that you can't just keep buying new and throwing the old products away? Is there a greater awareness, do you feel, in terms of life cycle management and maximising the life cycle of products?
I mean, certainly over the sort of past 5 years, there's been a significant change in what people want and expect from their furniture. And for us, we are obviously the end of life and so on is becoming an increasingly more important consideration. So if you're replacing a furniture, what do I do with the old furniture? That may sort of become problematic. How do we take it apart? How do we extract all the value out of that product for recycling? But certainly from a consumer point of view, we are increasingly getting those questions asked of us, and especially in sort of a high volume value sector that we occupy. You wouldn't have thought that those questions would be forthcoming, but they are, absolutely. And it's for us to make sure that with the sustainability programme and say with the end of life of product, that we meet those customers' demands as that demand curve increases.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I sit on a number of panels, and I'm a member also of the Furniture Makers Company, and some people turn to me and say, well, what you're talking about is actually counterintuitive, surely, because we're in business to make furniture and sell furniture, and yet you're saying let's maximize the life cycle. But I personally believe, and I know I would say this, but I strongly believe that those people are dinosaurs. If we don't accept that change is here and has to happen, and there are economic models to make that change, where companies can still earn money, because it has to be, part of sustainability is that we do this because we want to get paid money, ultimately. Do you think I'm right?
Again, I think the furniture industry is in a different position to, say, something like the fashion industry. Furniture purchasing is a significant investment for anyone, but it's not a frequent one. It's not like I'm going to go down Primark and buy 5 tops. It's not that mentality. And if you look historically, furniture has lasted. Furniture is a long-term investment. And I think that is part of the story. So you're not wanting to sell over and over to the same people. You're wanting the people who buy from you to say, yes, that is the furniture that I wanted, and it's what you want as well. So I think the furniture industry can't be complacent, but I think it is in a better position than some other sectors of the consumer products industry.
I guess that's, typically some of the sort of big high street retailers, certainly turn the clock back 15 years, could have been criticised of going down the sort of more fast fashion route. Do you think there is a mindset change as well within the industry?
Oh, definitely. I would say that, the model, sort of similar to sort of fast fashion, throwaway, disposable furniture, it might last me 18 months and I'll get rid and move on. That's completely changed. and our customers want something that's going to last, and so for us, I'm sort of, extend, warranties to lifetime warranties now for as long as the customer owns it. So for us, we're reacting to that change in demand for consumers, and say they want that furniture to last for as long as possible, and they want to feel good about making that purchase. And thankfully, to say we haven't gone down that route of fast fashion, highly disposable product.
And it's quite, I guess, bringing it back to what we're meant to be talking about, which is the Furniture Industry Sustainability Programme. I do think that's got a fundamental role in helping manufacturers to see that, and to see that it's not just about carbon footprint. I mean, I find it interesting that I saw one of the big brands of trainers are now putting a carbon footprint label on their trainer to say what the carbon footprint is of that trainer. But I think it's a very simplistic metric. I guess it's just raising the profile. But have you got a view, John?
Carbon footprinting is a big bugbear. It has a lot of different elements that go into it, some of which are quite political and some of which are potentially controversial. For example, some people suggest that the concept of personal carbon budgets were basically an invention of the oil industry to basically absolve themselves and push it on to the consumers. So there's that approach to it. But measuring carbon is one thing. Reducing carbon and planning to decarbonise is what we really should be talking about. So a measurement is fine, but if you're a consumer, knowing that a trainer or a sofa has a particular carbon value to it, where does that sit in terms of you driving to a retail park to buy it, you going on holiday, you buying a new fridge, television, clothing? It's got to be put into context. A number in itself is meaningless out of context.
I guess my other hobby horse, shall we say, is that looking at a chair, you might see one chair that, say, an office chair, that might have a carbon footprint of, say, 70, and typically 70 kilos of carbon equivalent, sorry, to give it its full title. And then you'll see a new one's just been launched, and that's only 50 kilos. But ultimately, if you're simply throwing the old one in a skip, then you've got to add the 70 kilos onto the 50 kilos of the one that you've got in the first place. I know that's also very simplistic, but I think it's this obsession with measuring carbon footprint. I think it's a positive thing in that it's about awareness, but I think bringing it back to the FISP concept, where you're looking at the totality of what you're doing and working towards a carbon reduction, is far more positive.
Yeah, and what we encourage people to do is, yes, if you've got product carbon footprints, if you've got organisational carbon footprints, that's important. But it is a step on the strategy to reducing your carbon targets. And what we're looking for is people who have energy reduction targets, carbon-based energy reduction targets, because they're not always identical, and reducing impacts in all the different sectors. So not just focusing on carbon, because sustainability is much more than just carbon.
Absolutely. Well, I guess we've spoken loads, and could I throw it open in case anybody's got any questions? If not, we'll carry on. Anybody want to ask anything? I guess not, John. We've been let off lightly, Ian. So bringing it back then, Ian, where do you see the future? I mean, we've talked briefly about circularity, and I was having a conversation just now about why do we have to own furniture? I mean, we as a culture in this country do tend to own furniture. Well, we tend to own everything. We like buying houses. We like buying cars. We might finance them in order to do that. But do you think there might be a future for renting a sofa? Or maybe not a carpet, but a sofa?
Yeah. I suppose almost moving it into a service rather than it sort of being a commodity. We've looked at that model and so on, and we think that ultimately maybe in in the sort of the longer term, there'll be more and more people that will be their chosen method of purchase. Because, for example, if people are renting for 12 months and moving on, they're not going to always want to buy furniture. But yeah, we will. I think in the fullness of time, it will start to move towards that as a service rather than it being an acquisition.
I find it interesting that we are going back to this, because if you think back to, well, sure you can't remember Ian, but back in the sort of 60s and 70s, no one ever owned their telly, or very few people did. They would rent it. Even things like washing machines is starting to happen again. I mean, even more recently, I must admit, we rented a TV for a while because technology was changing so rapidly that we didn't know what to buy. And perhaps that's why furniture has traditionally been exempt, because you don't have the technology changes you do, perhaps, say, in TV and so forth. But nonetheless, I think there will be a sea change back to, perhaps also because so many of the younger generation are having to rent their properties. And so therefore they might rent for a number of years before they can finally afford or aspire to buy. And the sofa or whatever, the bed or whatever it might be, may be irrelevant in their new home. So maybe furniture as a service will be a growth opportunity. John, have a view?
I think that is a model, and I think from the contract sector, that is something that I think might happen more, because then revamping becomes a different concept and rebranding and things, because that's often associated with big changes in office design and requirements. I think a lot of what's going to happen is a conversation with the consumer that has got to be positive. So much around sustainability and environment can come from a very negative place, which is understandable considering the things that are happening. But the solutions have got to come as a positive story and an opportunity. And I think one of the things we've not talked about is what role legislation and government lead has got to play in this, because I think some organisations are perhaps reluctant to commit to a specific route of sustainability in fear that another thing will be imposed on them later, and the way they've gone is a dead end, and they've invested in that. So I think clarity about the destination needs to be coming from central government.
Well, we're still waiting for a feedback from the waste consultation paper, which must have been, I want to say May 2020, roughly.
No, it was the following year. It was 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
COVID blurs the mind, doesn't it? But, and we're still waiting for an answer on that. I mean, I find it interesting in France and many European countries now that they actually have an EPR scheme where a fee is charged to the manufacturer that they obviously then put on the product, but then can be reclaimed and discounted based on how those products are then being redesigned. But as you rightly say, until we get some clarity on the way to go, companies are loath to make big commitments to change until we know where we're going with this one.
Absolutely. I think sustainability is the big challenge for the industry and the nation, and we need to be taking steps. And I think what FISP is trying to do is making people think about where you start that journey, and so that when things are imposed, because it's a voluntary scheme, people can participate and do the things they need to and reflect that. It's a start on that journey. And what we hope is that with this modular approach, it's flexible enough for when things do become mandatory, those people who've joined FISP and are part of FISP, that conversation will be a lot easier, and the decisions they need to make are a lot easier once they've got that focus around understanding the sustainable impacts of their products across their supply chain.
And hopefully, it also provides a forum. If you know that another company which is allied to your own is a member of FISP, and you're not sure of the best route to go down. Again, perhaps collaboration, it provides a natural opportunity to identify sort of same thinking type organizations. I mean, Ian, you're asking your supply chain, and I'm sure some have stepped up and really enjoying maybe I'm being over ambitious, but appreciate the reasons for joining and being part of FISP. Yeah. Do you actually provide sort of a support network for those that perhaps, rather than, are you mandating it and you simply saying, right, you've got to do this, or are you helping your supply chain to come on board, as it were?
Well, I suppose from our perspective, what we wanted to do was to get FISP first. We wanted to make sure that if we were going to have that conversation, we do so from a position of knowledge, and we've been there ourselves. So it makes us more credible, so that when we are sort of reacting and changing to legislative developments, we do so from a position of confidence. And what we've found is that a lot of our suppliers are actually quite further along the journey with FISP than what they initially thought, because everyone does little bits on a piecemeal basis and they're really good at certain bits and so on and so forth. But FISP allows us to put it all together and have that sensible conversation. And it may well be the case of that some suppliers may struggle more in certain areas than others, and that's our role to step in and to support them in pushing their own sustainability journey forward.
Often it takes somebody from the outside to see where simple steps can be taken to make those changes, can't it? Be it through a FISP audit. How often do you have an audit, John?
Well, I'm doing one tomorrow.
No, meaning once you've become...
Basically, it depends on whether you have ISO 14001. If you're an ISO 14001 accredited company, you're audited every 2 years. If you don't have ISO 14001, you are audited every year. And a lot of companies basically use FISP as almost a stepping stone as they're going towards ISO 14001, because it deals with a lot of similar things. It asks you to think about your impacts and aspects, and you're having targets and the areas you deal with. But it also looks at environmental management systems. So if they're going for FISP, if they've got ISO 14001, we would not expect them to have any problem going for FISP. But the other way around, once they've got FISP, they can probably see a way to implementing ISO 14001.
And is that something, 14001, is that something you require of your supply chain, or is FISP
we ask for it, but equally we have to recognise that environmental management systems is a significant amount of resource and so on and so forth, and it might not be appropriate for the size of that organisation. So we ask in the alternative for FISP. And again, what we've found is that does then allow them to critically evaluate where they're at, and then if they then decide then that they want 14001 and so on, then that's a decision that they can take. But for us, FISP is in the right in the middle of what our sustainability strategy is, because we believe it's the best approach. What I've found with 14001 is it's a filing system. Whereas FISP is more of a principle-based approach, and it's actually more tailored to the individual business rather than it sort of being a broad brush approach.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's one of the problems with a number of the standards is that it's a sort of tick box exercise. You've got those systems in place. Yes, continuous improvement is built into the standard, but equally is perhaps not as measured as diligently as perhaps maybe through a FISP process. And FISP, I think the whole point of it is it's meant to be about continuous improvement, but it's also meant to be a very positive program. So it's not looking to beat you up about it, quite the reverse. And I think that's the whole point, is that we want everyone to come on board and everybody make those incremental steps for change.
When I've gone round and done FISP audits, I've always found it a very, very positive experience. Some organisations, and particularly coming out of the COVID period, there was a lot of issues with us not being able to go on site and staff turnover in a lot of organisations. So sometimes when I've come to do them an audit, but people who would previously been audited are no longer available. So they're coming to it cold. And so it's a very useful opportunity to have those discussions around all the different aspects of sustainability. And they will ask me questions. So, oh, well, what do we do? Have you seen other examples of things like this? How do we account for this? Or sort of, do we need to do this and this? So they ask questions, they want to learn, and they think very carefully about where they're going to go forward with that. And I've found it across all the organisations, been to some of the very big ones and some of the very small ones, they are engaged with FISP and they really see it as a positive way forward.
Brilliant. Well, it's been a great start to Monday morning. Unless anybody's got any questions, we will be around, so please do come and say hi. I hope the messages that you've got from us today is FISP is a very embracing programme. It's essential. It's the direction of travel for our industry, whether we like it or not. Hopefully you like it. And it's also about our futures. It's about people and it's about planet. So thank you for listening to us this morning, and have a good show. Thank you.